Thank you very much. I'll go, and if Juan comes, he can go right after me. I will just stick to my 5 minutes religiously. The topic is the economic rights of the poor, and I want to discuss it from the point of view of what Catholic social teaching has to say about the economic rights of the poor. And I'm going to argue that it has actually a lot to say, and it's got a very rich and fruitful history in that regard. Well, what is a right? A right, of course, is simply a moral claim that others are obliged to accept. And we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have the idea of universal human rights. Some might think it's a funny argument to argue that Catholic social teaching has a lot to say about this, because the church actually came late to the idea of universal human rights. If you go back to the 19th century, it was on the side of monarchies who rejected things like democracy, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, political rights such as that. But notwithstanding all of that, the church always had the intellectual apparatus to make this shift towards universal human rights, but in a way that distinctly reflected its own intellectual tradition. So a kind of a separation from the European Enlightenment tradition. And here I want to reference 3 separate books. Since I only have 5 minutes, so I'll just mention the 3 books rather than describing what each of them says. The first book is by Samuel Moyn, and it's called Christian Human Rights. Moyn makes the argument that the universal human rights as underpinned by human dignity actually comes out of the Catholic intellectual tradition in the interwar period, the 1930s and 1940s. Before that, it was very much French Revolution. But the idea of human dignity, which is now central, everybody talks about it, but that's a very Catholic understanding, a very Catholic anthropology. So that's Moyn's book. The second book I want to recommend is a book by James, I don't know if it's Chappell, but he wrote a book called Catholic Modern, and he argued at that same time, at that same period, you had a division between what he called fraternal Catholicism and paternal Catholicism. One branched off into kind of social democracy, and the other branched off into Christian democracy. And of course, the great British historian Tony Judd, who wrote a magnificent volume called Post-War, he actually argued that on the economic sphere, Christian Democrats and Social Democrats were actually very closely aligned, especially in that early post-war period where this was all being worked out. So that's the second book. The third book is by a British theologian called Anna Rowlands, it's kind of a strange title. It's called Towards a Politics of Communion, Catholic Social Teaching in Dark Times. Yes. And she argues that, again, it was a very fecund period, that post-war, interwar and post-war period. And she points to the character of Pope Pius XII, who's often forgotten and often neglected in the history of Catholic social teaching. But he actually, in his Christmas messages, was looking forward, looking towards what a post-war Europe might look like, a post-war world. And he discussed such issues as, again, human rights founded upon human dignity, very much as Pope Francis today is looking towards a post-COVID world using the principles of Catholic social teaching. So I think that during this period, the Catholic intellectual tradition really worked out its view of economic rights and economic rights of the poor. And this found its fullest form in the 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris by Pope John XXIII. And I'm going to quote that because he says, as he lists the rights, and again, remember, this is in 1963, he says, man has the right to live. He has the right to bodily integrity and to the means necessary for the proper development of life, particularly food, clothing, shelter, medical care, rest, and finally, the necessary social services. In consequence, he has the right to be looked after in the event of ill health, disability stemming from his work, widowhood, old age, enforced unemployment, or whenever, through no fault of his own, he is deprived of the means of his livelihood. That, to me, I can't find a better encapsulation of what the economic rights of the poor actually means. And that's the foundation of human rights in the Catholic tradition. So 3 points to note about that. The first is the emphasis on economic rights. The economic rights are actually listed first and foremost Actually, they even become before the political rights. And that's because, you know, it relates to the idea of positive freedom, the freedom to develop your own capacities in the Aristotelian sense, as opposed to the negative freedom, the freedom from coercion in the libertarian sense. So the Catholic social teaching roots rights firmly in the dignity of the human person, pointing to integral human development, or as Jacques Maritain, one of the authors of the Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, put it, integral humanism. So the second differentiating factor then is that rights are not individualistic. They're based on the common good. So Catholic social teaching has no truck with any libertarian ideologies. And again, I quote Samuel Moyn. Samuel Moyn basically said, if you divorce rights from duties, you can easily offer, it becomes very easy to slide into away from powerful public visions of social interdependence, collective agency, or planetary responsibility. So therefore, the third distinction then is Catholic approach always links fundamental rights with fundamental duties. They are seen as two sides of the same coin. And if you just declare a right out of thin air without a corresponding duty, then it's just something you've pulled out of thin air. So I would argue then, I think that's my 5 minutes, 3 key points there. Economic rights of the poor, rooted in Catholic social teaching. Economic rights are central, common good rather than individualism, and always link rights and duties. And I think this is a very powerful vision of what economic rights of the poor would mean. Thank you.